Welcome to the Science of Perfection podcast. Join me in exploring a new paradigm, an ancient, modernly applicable philosophy of everything. Life does come with a guidebook. It's called the Vedas, and scholar, scientist, and teacher Ashish Dalela presents its wisdom in an accessible manner. I'm audiobook narrator and yoga student Leslie Howard. In these episodes, I will be narrating articles from the website shabda.co that reveal exciting insights on how the world works, the shortcomings of modern science and religions, and how we can integrate logic, physics, biology, psychology, sociology, and philosophy into a consistent worldview that resolves the concepts of oneness and difference and gives hope, wisdom, and guidance for understanding our lives and our purpose. For our debut article, I will be reading Why Akasha is Not Ether from Shabda Journal, August 11th, 2025, by Ashish Dalela. Why Akasha is Not Ether. The birth of relativity theory. The advent of Einstein's special and general theories of relativity in 1905 and 1915 did something unprecedented in science. They destroyed the Newtonian ideas of space and time as containers within which the world exists. Until that time, people thought, and many people unaware of modern physics still think today, that we are bodies living inside space and time. It meant that words like distance and duration had an objective meaning, measurable using meters and clocks. Einstein destroyed that concept completely. He showed that distance and duration did not have an objective meaning, that each observer could potentially perform the same measurement and get a different value. Space and time after that came to mean each observer's coordinate reference frame, the private canvas on which an observer drew a picture of the world, not the public canvas that had been previously assumed. By the way, this idea was not entirely new. There were at least two philosophers whom Einstein relied upon to justify the privatization of the canvas, because it deviated so significantly from the views of the scientific orthodoxy that it required an intuitive explanation beyond the mathematical formulation. First was Immanuel Kant, who had earlier stated that words like time, space, causality, and law were not objective facts about the world, but merely human ways of thinking. Did that mean science was simply a personal opinion? No, said Kant, because everyone was supposed to think of the world in the same way, as their minds were hardwired to conceptualize reality based on a certain fixed set of categories, which Kant called synthetic a priori. They were synthetic in the sense that they were not analytic, that is, derived from something more fundamental, like a theorem derived from axioms. They were a priori in the sense that they weren't a posteriori, that is, gathered through the observation of the world. Thereby, space and time weren't out there, they were in here, in our minds, and we used these to organize sense perceptions into a coherent picture. We were the canvas on which we drew a picture of the world. Everyone had the same type of canvas, so everyone drew the same picture. And due to the commonality in the minds doing science, a commonality of their pictures resulted, which made science possible. Second was Rudolf Carnap, who was waging a movement to convert all words in philosophy to words of measurement. Philosophers, he stated, had been preoccupied for centuries with abstract words such as truth, beauty, and justice. But no progress had been made, and this pursuit for the meanings of these abstract words was a complete waste of time. Instead, he said, we should try to define all these words in precisely measurable terms. All those words that could not be precisely defined should be considered meaningless until they were so defined. Einstein looked within physics and found many such words, space and time being two of them. Taking the concept of meaningful and meaningless words forward, Einstein concluded that these must be reduced to something measurable if these words had to be used in science. He then concluded that there was no meaning to the word space other than a procedure of measurement by a meter, and no meaning to the word time other than a procedure of measurement by a clock. Thereafter, for Einstein, space just meant meter and time just meant clock. Everyone was carrying their personal meter and clock, so everyone was carrying their personal space and time. Relying on these two philosophers for justification, Einstein explained why the speed of light was found constant even for observers moving at different speeds. Their clocks and meters weren't the same. Rather, meters could expand and contract, and clocks could run slower or faster. Speed was simply distance divided by duration, but the measured distance depended on the meter, and the measured duration depended on the clock. If the meter expanded, the measured distance would be lesser, and if the clock ran slower, the measured duration would be lesser. And the speed we got subsequently by dividing distance by duration would be the same, if the factor by which the distance was lesser was the same as the factor by which the duration was lesser. Since each observer was carrying a personal meter and clock, they were effectively carrying a private space and time. The observer was not inside some public space and time, as was postulated in Newtonian mechanics. These were private constructs, but empirical and objective, and yet not common for all observers, as Kant had previously presumed. The story behind the ether. The public Newtonian space till that time was called ether. Newton had used the ether hypothesis to explain inertia. That is why we needed force to move an object. He believed that ether was the medium in which the world existed. It was like an ocean of water that offered resistance to all moving bodies within it. The swimmers exert against the resistance offered by water, which he called force. Likewise, force was needed to move stationary things because these things were just like swimmers in a water body. Einstein's theory of relativity debunked the existence of ether. There was no shared common or public medium in which the world existed. Space and time were observer-unique realities, measured through personal meters and clocks, which could expand or contract, run slower or faster. The Newtonian ether now came to be known as the absolute space, while Einsteinian space came to be called relative space. Absolute space had no scientific reality. It was simply a postulate that had to be rejected to explain the constant speed of light. Notions of space and time had to be relativized to each individual observer. Problems in defining Akasha. Incidentally, Sanskrit-English dictionaries had already been constructed by this time. In them, the word Akasha had already been translated as ether, because in 18th and 19th century Europe, the Newtonian hypothesis of an ether was considered true. Even after Einstein's relativity debunked the existence of ether, these dictionary translations were never revised. Due to the fact that hardly anyone understands Einstein's theories of relativity outside a small circle of physicists, and linguists certainly have no clue about what goes on in physics, the translations of Vedic texts into English use the dictionary translation of Akasha as ether, because the dictionary had been created before Einstein debunked the ether. And so everyone, including myself, keeps referring to Akasha as ether, and everyone assumes it is okay. It is not okay. But to understand that, we have to realize that what we call space and time are simply private realities. Specifically, the world we see with our eyes is a construction within the eyes. We don't really know how the world exists outside the eyes or before we observe the world. Our eyes are the space and time, the canvas on which a picture of the world is painted. Of course, we think that the empty patches on the canvas correspond to the empty space in the world, but there is no way to be sure if that is indeed the case. For instance, it is possible that the empty patches on the canvas are the result of our inability to see what exists, either because it can't be seen or because our eyes aren't seeing it. We create an empty patch on the canvas by our inability to see, and call that empty space, when it may be neither empty nor space, but the result of something not being seeable or we are not seeing it. Factually, Greeks called the things we cannot see air rather than ether, while monist Greek philosophers believed that the 4 Greek elements, earth, water, fire, and air, were transforms of one fundamental element. They called it Empyrean. Even that element was matter, not space. While Greeks sometimes used the word ether, it meant regions above the clouds. There was no ether inside planet Earth. People were living in air, not in ether. Up until the time of Descartes, 42 years before Newton, the world was called res extensa. That is, an extended substance, which was a substance with the property of extension, but it was matter, not space. Space and time were properties of that substance, but the substance wasn't contained within space and time. The separation of space, time, and matter in Newtonian physics came out of Indian mathematics, not anything native to European thinking. However, even for Newton, space was not truly empty. It was like a body of water offering resistance to the swimmers. The fact that we cannot see this body of water simply meant that it was either not seeable or we weren't seeing it. The need for multiple spaces. Further problems arise in our conception of space if we recognize that we are carrying multiple canvases on which the world is painted differently. For instance, we can close our eyes and not see the painting on the visual canvas, but there are other canvases of sound, touch, smell, and taste in which the world is expressed differently than on the visual canvas. By the fact that we can close 4 of the 5 senses and still get a representation of the world means that there are 5 unique canvases, not just one. Now we can't even use the word space in singular. We have to use the word spaces in plural to account for the fact that there are 5 different canvases on which we could paint the world in 5 different ways as sound, touch, sight, taste, and smell. Of course, our sense apparatus combines these 5 spaces into one to create a unified picture of reality, but each of these canvases can work by itself in isolation. Neuroscientists know that even as these spaces work in isolation for most people, they aren't truly or fully isolated. For instance, some people see shapes and movement when they hear sounds, which is perhaps why conductors of orchestra originally began moving their hands to synthesize the sounds of many instruments. This phenomenon is called synesthesia. Nearly all of us have experienced our mouths watering after smelling food. The word synesthesia captures the general phenomenon under which the stimulation of one sense triggers sensations in another. We even use phrases like tastefully decorated and distasteful character to describe what we perceive, even when we haven't tasted them. So there are 5 distinct canvases, but they are not totally mutually exclusive. Each canvas can work in isolation. Experiences in each canvas can trigger experiences in other canvases. All these canvases are combined into a single canvas for most people most of the time, unless their senses are not working. And even when they are combined, we can exclusively focus on one canvas, ignoring the rest. The additional fact is that all that we can smell, we can also taste, see, touch, and hear. All that we can taste, we can also see, touch, and hear. All that we can see, we can also touch and hear. However, the converse is not true. For instance, the words we speak are not touched. We can touch ordinary air, but we don't see it, taste it, or smell it. Many things we can see have no taste or smell. While it is rare, some things can be tasted but never smelled. It means there is hierarchy of sensations, with bidirectional causation that we described above as synesthesia. Mere words can make us feel hot or cold, create images in our eyes, create taste in our mouth, and create smells in our nose. It doesn't happen all the time, at all the places, in all situations for everyone, but it happens selectively and occasionally. The difficult idea of hearing. Some of you might say that I can see and touch a table but not hear it. What most people expect to hear when they talk about hearing a table is some special type of vibration unique to that table. But hearing in Vedic texts means shabda, which is translated as sound, but more accurately, it means speech. More specifically, by sound, we don't mean a special frequency, but ordinary words such as table used to refer to it. If all our senses are working, the moment we see a table, we hear the word table in our ears. The moment we see a chair, we hear the word chair in our ears. If all the senses are working at once, there is no perception in which we touch, see, taste, and smell something, but not assign those experiences a description in terms of words. We might believe that nobody spoke those words, that we created them ourselves. But even then, the fact is that we hear such words. How hard is it to say that we heard those words because the table and the chair spoke to us, telling us about themselves? Many of us have heard of phrases such as, "The situation was crying for help. This boy was begging to be punished. And the world spoke to me in no uncertain terms." In these situations, we may not see an English-speaking person talking to us in English, but we hear things in English that nobody has seemingly spoken. We assume that things that nobody has spoken must have been created by us, but that doesn't matter as long as we hear those things while touching, seeing, tasting, or smelling the world. The assignment of words to reality can occur after the mind has processed sensations. But if the sensory and mental faculties are working, every perception involves assignment of words, which we hear just as if they were spoken by someone else. Therefore, we always hear, even when we see a table or a chair, although because we associate speech with some English speaker talking to us in English, whom we have not seen, we find it difficult to accept that we are hearing. To overcome this difficulty, we have to go back to the fact we have established so far. That is, that a reality is painted on multiple canvases, and what we mean by hearing, touching, seeing, tasting, and smelling is the imprints on our personal canvases. There are situations in which we can hear, but not touch, see, taste, or smell. But there is no situation, if all the sensory and mental faculties are working, that we touch, see, taste, or smell without hearing. The world is always speaking to us, even if we think there are no English speakers around us, because we hear English words while perceiving the world, exactly as if they were spoken by English speakers. Of course, I don't mean to say that everyone hears English words. Depending on their native language, they hear different language words. But they always hear some words, exactly like they were spoken by some human speaker in their language. Effectively, the world always speaks to them in their language. We just have a hard time accepting it if we exclusively tie language to humans, not tables or chairs. The real meaning of Akasha. That brings us to the meaning of Akasha. I will state the definition here, and then explain it using the concepts we have discussed so far. Akasha is the correct linguistic description of anything, correctly or incorrectly imprinted in our sense of hearing as our personal linguistic description of reality. This is why in Sankhya, the Buddha called Akasha is associated with two other entities, A, the Indriya called Shrota, or the sense of hearing, and B, the Tanmatra called Shabda, or the property of sound. For the time being, think of Akasha as a canvas on which words like table and chair are imprinted. This is not entirely accurate, which I shall explain why and refine this idea later in this article. Our sense of hearing interacts with this canvas, and if the interaction is transparent, it hears words such as table and chair. The assignment of words to reality is thus, in Sankhya, not always an invention of the human mind. Instead, the true nature of reality, as its linguistic description, can also be heard by the sense of hearing. Our senses are like the meters and clocks that Einstein used in relativity theory that register some value of distance and duration. But there is an objective or true distance and duration that exists independent of our observation, which Einstein's theory remained agnostic about, because for Einstein there is no way to know the true distance and duration apart from the manner in which we measure them using meters and clocks. Einstein's relativization of measurement entailed an agnosticism about reality, not necessarily its rejection, because Einstein was pursuing the philosophy of Carnap, in which we have to reduce the meanings of words, like space and time, to the outcomes of empirical procedures. To talk of truth, independent of measurement, would be to talk metaphysics, that is, something beyond physics. But rejection of metaphysics is also the rejection of reality. It entails that there is factually no reality that we are measuring, or that our measuring instruments creatively generate numbers out of thin air. Akasha is space in Sankhya. However, it doesn't comprise numerical values of distance expressed in physical theories such as the XYZ coordinates of geometry. Locations in Akasha are words like table and chair, the correct linguistic descriptions of reality, which we can hear during perception. Unless we say that all words are manufactured by our senses out of thin air, there is a reality, which is also the true linguistic description of the thing we are perceiving. Insofar as we can know the truth, which remains the basis of all epistemology, there must be a way to know the correct description of the world. The problem of epistemology. Of course, it doesn't mean that everyone hears the Akasha description correctly. That truth is stated to be known in Vedic texts after the purification of the senses, which, for the linguistic description, involves the removal of personal prejudices from the act of hearing. More specifically, we must be eager to hear the truth and disinterested in hearing lies before our sense of hearing can be considered purified. Such a sense will always get the correct description of reality, and thus know the truth of everything. All problems of epistemology are therefore about the impurity in the senses. More precisely, we are not eager for the truth, but we are interested in lies. We want the world to conform to our prejudices and biases, rather than know the world just as it is. As long as we remain disinterested in the truth, the world is perceived imperfectly. But if the senses are purified, we touch, see, taste, and smell the world, and the correct linguistic description is automatically heard in the ears, as if someone spoke to us truthfully. Thus, the focus of epistemology shifts from building instruments and theories to purifying the senses. Once the senses are purified, They are the perfect instruments, which automatically know the truth. There is no need for instruments and theories if we can purify our senses. Of course, instruments and theories may be used to convince people of the need to purify their senses to know the truth. For instance, we can rely on relativity theory to establish the fact that distances and durations measured by meters and clocks are not objective truths, but numerical values unique to each observer. If there is a reality beyond measurement, we have no way of knowing if our measurement reveals it, which led Einstein to conclude that relativistic measurement of distance and duration entail a relative space and time. This idea can be extended to multiple properties, not just duration and distance, telling us that what we call observation is simply imprints on different types of canvas. To go beyond the imprints on the canvas into knowing what the reality is, we have to say that the value on the canvas would be correct if the measuring instrument that detects it is working perfectly. We can't trust the outcome of measurement with a faulty measuring instrument. Likewise, we cannot trust sense perception with faulty senses. The fault in the senses is that they are biased and prejudiced to see the world in ways that conform to their desires. If the desires in the senses are purified to become the desire for truth and disdain for the untruth, then the instrument of perception has been purified to know the truth. The problem of mathematics. In Einstein's relativity, space-time is a four-tuple of numbers written as x, y, z, t, which is also a linguistic description if we consider mathematics a language. However, mathematics can never be consistent and complete due to Gödel's incompleteness theorem. While calculating distances and durations, we can choose different coordinate systems, Cartesian, cylindrical, polar, spherical, and the numerical values of locations in space and time would differ accordingly. These values are not objective truths. They are our ways of describing the world, subject to our choices, but not invariant across different observer choices. For instance, we could change the system of coordinates, or interchange the locations of a table and chair, thereby changing the values in the four-tuple without altering reality. Likewise, the incompleteness of mathematics entails that there is no complete set of numerical properties that can describe reality consistently and completely. It is seen in quantum theory and results in probabilistic descriptions. I have described these probabilities as resulting from trying to measure text rather than read it. We can count the probabilities of letter recurrence in a text, but those probabilities are not reading the text. Factually, we can measure the length and weight of a book, but that is not the same as reading the book. The quantum problem has a simple analog in everyday life, which we can illustrate by the example of cutting an apple. Factually, there are two ways of cutting an apple, which I call classical and quantum. In the classical way of cutting an apple, we use a knife to split the apple into pieces. But in the quantum way of cutting an apple, we try to split the apple into its shape, color, size, hardness, roughness, taste, and smell. Factually, we can never truly separate an apple's properties, such as smell and taste, which is why quantum cutting of the apple always results in inseparable properties, which atomic theory calls entanglement. Properties like taste and smell are distinct but not separable. These properties can also never be quantified, and so there is no complete numerical description of reality. And yet, we can perceive properties like taste and smell, and describe them using ordinary words like sweet and sour. Once we combine these properties correctly, we can also describe the apple by the word apple. Physical versus semantic realities. After recognizing the incompleteness of mathematics and how it appears as the probabilities in the study of matter, we can return to the question of space and time. the space and time conceptualized in physics, both Newtonian and Einsteinian, is an incomplete numerical description because it totally disregards the existence of meaning and its effects on matter. It assumes that there is nothing outside space, when the fact is that meaning is not within that space. Space was called ether in Newtonian physics due to the presumption that space was like an ocean of water that resisted a swimmer. After the ether hypothesis was debunked in Einsteinian relativity, space-time became numbers measured by meters and clocks, agnostic about whether these were true. In principle, one can say that clocks and meters manufacture values of durations and distances out of thin air. But nobody makes that claim, because it is far too troubling for physicists to claim that observation manufactures a picture. The path out of agnosticism or rejection of reality is that space is linguistic descriptions. Different observers can give inaccurate descriptions if they don't comprehend all the properties completely and consistently. They may even perceive each of these properties inaccurately. Those inaccuracies and incomplete or inconsistent descriptions, however, don't prevent us from knowing the truth. A moving observer in relativity theory is just like a casual reader of a book who rapidly flips pages without fully understanding what the book is saying. He gets an inaccurate understanding of the book, which is both a fact and a falsehood. His inaccurate understanding is a fact, and yet a falsehood. The introduction of meaning allows us to distinguish fact from truth. Flipping the pages of the book rapidly is a fact, but not knowing the meaning correctly creates a falsehood, such that facts and falsehoods exist at once. I call the linguistic description of reality a semantic worldview, to contrast it to the physical worldview prevalent in modern science. In the physical worldview, space is numerical values expressed as a three-tuple, x, y, z, but in the semantic worldview, space comprises words like table that describe something. We can have words for everything we touch, see, taste, and smell, but we can never quantify all that we perceive. Therefore, there is a complete linguistic description of reality, but no such mathematical description exists. Trying to force a mathematical description on reality, when we can prove that this attempt can never work, both theoretically and empirically, reveals our prejudice and bias, which leads to an illusion of modern science discovering the nature of reality, although it is far from the truth. Misrepresentation of Akasha. Therefore, Akasha is neither the ether of Newtonian mechanics nor the space-time of Einsteinian relativity. As already noted, the translation of Akasha as ether is simply an artifact of history. The Sanskrit English dictionary was created at a time when Europeans believed that Newtonian ether was real, and they imputed their Newtonian assumption upon Akasha, translating it as ether. The translation didn't change even after the ether hypothesis was debunked because linguists don't know physics. And so, all of us, including me, have been translating Akasha as ether, because what other choice do we have? Strictly speaking, we could redefine the ether as a linguistic description of things, akin to words like table and chair. Or we could use the word Akasha to mean the same thing. The problem is that this is not just an issue with Akasha, but with literally every word from the Vedic texts. If we choose to redefine words, then we have to rewrite the Sanskrit English dictionaries. However, if we revert all English words back to Sanskrit words, we cannot communicate with an English-speaking audience. That was indeed the case for centuries when the Vedic tradition was known only in India and taught to people born in the Vedic culture through a disciplic succession. Those who wanted to learn the Vedic texts traveled to universities in India, lived in India for long durations, learned the language and the concepts. All these facts about the Vedic tradition were undermined during colonial times when Europeans created dictionaries in which words did not mean the same as before. Europeans began translating Vedic texts based on mistaken dictionaries and then taught them in Western academia. Their misrepresentations brought enormous misunderstanding and practically no understanding of the Vedic tradition. In fact, when these misunderstandings were pointed out, Western academia chose to persist with them, clearly indicating that there was something more than misunderstanding that was perpetuating it. Those who know the Vedic tradition can ignore these misrepresentations, or they can try to correct them. I have chosen to correct. However, correction requires each word, such as Akasha, to be explained in detail using an article such as this one, even to reconcile the fact that the property of Akasha is sound, which is heard by the sense of hearing. Facts that are clearly noted in Vedic texts, but were never part of an ether. Physical to semantic reset. All these misrepresentations arise out of a physical worldview, which began with Greeks, carried into monotheistic religions, and then got embedded in modern science. If doubts about the correctness of this worldview arose, they were resolved by separating mind from matter, putting language, perceptions, thoughts, judgments, and emotions, everything that the physical worldview never explained, into a dustbin called the mind, which was shoved into a corner, only to be examined by the psychologists. Meanwhile, physics carried on with the mainstream physical and mathematical view of reality, which worked quite well initially, but all the falsehoods follow the law of diminishing returns. In the beginning, the returns are disproportionately greater than the effort. After some time, the returns are proportionate to the effort. Eventually, returns are disproportionately lesser than the effort. Modern science has formally entered the last phase of the law of diminishing returns. In this phase, science is like a car spinning its wheel in wet mud. The more it spins its wheels, the deeper it sinks into wet mud, the harder it is to take the car out of wet mud. Ultimately, the driver has to abandon the car sunk into wet mud and buy a new car. This is the time for a full reset. It involves moving away from physical to semantic thinking. Objectivity versus subjectivity. I will now return to the definition of Akasha as a space of linguistic descriptions, and contend with the fact that all linguistic descriptions can be interpreted in many ways. If reality is words, interpretable in many ways, then how can we talk about an objective reality? Without objective reality, how can there be a science? The answer to this question goes through Nyaya philosophy, which recognizes two fundamental categories in reality called bhava and abhava, or presence and absence. But before I explain what these technical terms mean, let's employ ordinary examples to illustrate the problem and its solution. Take an ordinary object like a pen. Ideally, it is a pen, but non-ideally, it could be a weapon, paperweight, and ornament. However, it can never be a ship, airplane, or car. The descriptions of the thing as a pen, ornament, paperweight, and weapon are subjective truths in the sense that each person can choose one of the many descriptions. However, even these subjective truths are not private faith and belief, because we can rationally and empirically prove to anyone that the thing in question is factually a pen, ornament, paperweight, or weapon. The subjectivity pertains to the choice of interpretation. However, it is a valid choice rationally and empirically provable to anyone who wants to verify that it is not faith or belief. In contrast, the fact that the thing in question can never be a ship, airplane, or car is an objective truth, because it is true for everyone who relies on a rational and empirical method of verification. Now let's apply the same principle to language. Every word can be interpreted in many ways, but not all the possible ways. The word president can be used to indicate a specific human or a class of humans, but never a tree, a dog, or a fish. We can't say that a word has a fixed universal meaning, but we can say what a word doesn't mean universally. Each word is like a bag of meanings. There is a subjective choice of picking one or more meanings out of that bag, but we can't pick a meaning outside the bag. The fact that we can interpret the word in many ways doesn't mean we can interpret it in arbitrary ways. There is an objective reality, but it is not an object. It is rather a bag of potentials, possibilities, or alternatives. The pen and the word follow the same principle. Each can be interpreted in many ways, but not arbitrary ways. Similarly, both pen and word violate the notion of objectivity as objects. Therefore, objectivity has to be redefined, not as what something is, but as what something is not. What something is not is a universal truth that is true for everyone. What something is a subjective truth that is true for someone, but it is not a private belief or faith, as it can be proven rationally and empirically. Once we note the similarity between the pen and the word, we can treat the pen as a word. All of reality can now be treated as words, interpretable in many ways, but also not interpretable in other ways. Nyaya, presence, and absence. These principles of subjectivity and objectivity are called bhava and abhava, or presence and absence in Nyaya philosophy. These are not the only way in which these words are used, but I will restrict myself to this use for now, as the other uses of these words will take us far beyond the discussion of Akasha. The term bhava, or presence, means a set of potentials, possibilities, or alternatives which can be chosen as subjective truths. The term abhava, or absence, means all that is impossible, that is, the objective truth. Note how both presence and absence are necessary if reality is semantic, because we can interpret words and things in many ways, but not arbitrary ways. Only presence is necessary if reality is indeed physical. This entails a revision to our earlier description of Akasha as words like table and chair. Factually, what we call a table or chair could also be called a ladder, workbench, or furniture. However, it can't be called a mosquito, bee, or ant. Hence, when we say that locations in Akasha are words, we mean that they are collections of possibilities, like multiple interpretabilities of words, not an object. Simply replacing a number with a word, treating both of them as physical tokens, doesn't address the problem of interpretability. We have to change the underlying ontology itself from physical to semantic. Quite specifically, a physical reality tells us what something is, but a semantic reality tells us what it is not. The Bhagavata Purana states, "The activities and characteristics of the ethereal element can be observed as the accommodation of room for the external and internal existences of all living entities, namely the field of activities of the vital air, the senses, and the mind." The internal and external existences are the bhava and abhava, or presence and absence of something. What is external to me is what I am not. It is the objective truth. But what is internal to me is a collection of potentials and possibilities which I have to activate through a choice, and hence it is a subjective truth. Just like a word, I am not a fixed object. Rather, just like a word, I am a collection of potentials and possibilities. That is the meanings of the word. If we want to simplify it, we could say that the outside is the word and the inside is the meaning. This inside-outside distinction is not physical because the inside is meaning and the outside is word, neither of which is numbers. Akasha creates a room for the inside and the outside of the living entities, so we can never equate it to a container of objects. Factually, objects don't have an inside. only an outside. And even that outside is numbers rather than words. Moreover, those numbers indicate what the thing is, not what it isn't. Therefore, Akasha is not equivalent to ether or space of modern science. To begin understanding Akasha, we have to begin by thinking of the inside and outside of a living entity. The underdetermination principle. Cartesian dualism separated the mind and body as two kinds of substances, creating the problem of mind-body interaction. That problem doesn't exist in the case of Akasha, because the mind and body are the inside and the outside of the same thing. However, neither inside nor outside is physical. Rather, the inside is meaning and the outside is word. These are not two separate substances interacting through some unknown causal mechanism. They are distinct and yet inseparable. It means changes to the body can bring changes to the mind and vice versa. But every change in the body doesn't entail a change to the mind, or vice versa. The mind and body are not identical, not separate, not independent, not dependent. The best way to describe them is underdetermination. A word underdetermines its meaning because the same word has many meanings. Each meaning underdetermines the word because that meaning can be expressed through many words. Given a meaning, many words, although not arbitrary words, can be used to express it. Given a word, many meanings, although not arbitrary meanings, can be expressed through it. The body and mind are like word and meaning. When we look at ourselves in the mirror, we never see the body itself. We see one of the infinite possible interpretations of the body. The body is a restriction on the possibilities, a bag that excludes many possibilities from which our senses select one possibility. Therefore, all empirical studies on the body are nearly worthless because on each observation, a different possibility can be observed. This fact is now empirically established by quantum theory. Every time we observe, we get a different result. We can, at most, make probabilistic predictions over infinite time, although the fact remains that neither do we have infinite time, nor can we fully capture infinite possibilities in a finite time. The same issue applies to every other type of observation, and far more if the possibilities are high. For instance, biology is now fully in thrall of the reproducibility crisis. Experiments done previously can't be repeated because each experiment reveals a new possibility. There are infinite such possibilities, but our time is finite. So each scientist can run an experiment and publish a paper, but hardly any experiment can be repeated. The scientist can also run many experiments and then cherry-pick those experiments that match the desired outcome, deceiving journal readers into thinking that they are reading about objective truths when they are, at best, subjective truths. The reproducibility crisis is a manifestation of the quantum nature of reality. That reality is a bag of potentialities from which an observation picks up one possibility. Of course, physicists have misled generations into thinking that the quantum realm of possibilities becomes a classical realm of certainty without ever establishing how that actually happens or whether it even happens. They don't want to accept that physical models of reality have failed comprehensively, and they suppress attempts to formulate alternative models of reality. This is an example of contaminated senses and mind. They are not eager for the truth or disdainful of the untruth. They are biased and prejudiced toward proving the lie. We can easily get out of this lie by replacing the physical models of reality with semantic models. In this model, space is Akasha, and it comprises words. When we touch, see, taste, or smell reality, we can hear a word. If we are eager for the truth, we can hear the correct word. but the word doesn't have a fixed meaning. Even the same meaning can be expressed through many different words. The relation between the word and meaning is underdetermination. It means that by looking at the body, we can rule out many mental states, but not know what the mental state actually is. Likewise, by knowing the mental state, we can rule out many bodily states, but not know what the bodily state actually is. The mind and body mutually fix what the other will not be, but do not fix what the other will be. Complete and partial truths. If we are dissatisfied with the possibility of multiple interpretations, then we can recognize the fact that there is always one ideal interpretation. For instance, a pen is ideally a pen. It is a weapon, ornament, or paperweight non-ideally. The ideal description is also the complete description, while the non-ideal descriptions are partial. For instance, while calling a pen a weapon, we focus on the hardness of the pointed tip and disregard the fact that it has ink within. While calling it a paperweight, we focus only on the weight of the pen, but the tip of the pin doesn't matter. While calling it an ornament, only the shell of the pen matters, and neither the tip of the pin nor the ink within it are important. We get non-ideal descriptions of the pen simply by disregarding parts of the whole truth, so they are partial truths, not the whole truth. However, a partial truth is not a falsehood. It can be proven and verified by anyone, so it is not blind faith or belief. It is a rational and empirical truth, and yet it is not the complete truth. Hence, the multiple interpretations of a thing arise when we focus on partial truths, not the whole truth. However, insofar as a feather can also be used as a pen, although it cannot be a weapon, ornament, or paperweight, the non-ideal interpretations of a pen are not irrelevant to defining a specific pen. Every pen cannot be an ornament, weapon, and paperweight, but some pens can be. Even as these are partial and non-ideal descriptions of the pen, they add to our understanding of the pen in question, such that we can distinguish between a feather and a pen. While both work as pens, the pen is not a feather. Semantic and physical space. Now that we understand that Akasha is a space of words, it is easy to understand how things described by similar words will be close to each other, while things described by different words will be far from each other. For instance, all tables are close to each other in Akasha. They form a cluster or class of things. This makes Akasha similar to a set in mathematics, if that set represents a collection of similar things. A set can contain dissimilar things too, so this distinction is important. This tells us how semantic and physical spaces are different. In a semantic space, similar things are close, and dissimilar things are far, as space means similarity of meaning. However, in a physical space, anything can be anywhere. Since a set can collect both similar and dissimilar things together, hence, the set concept is closer to physical space. Now someone can ask, my room contains a table, chair, bed, wardrobe, shoes, clothes, and so on, and it looks like a space to me. If Akasha is a semantic space with the proximity of similar things, then how do we get an ordinary space like a room in which dissimilar things are seen to have proximity? The answer is that individual things are taken from Akasha and combined in a new way to construct ordinary space. To illustrate this with an example, suppose you are a cook. Pulses in other canisters, salt and sugar in different boxes, water in a separate pot, vegetables in different bags, spices in different tubs, and so on. These vessels are like semantic classes, which hold one type of thing. However, while cooking, we take ingredients from different vessels and combine them in a recipe. Our room is just like a recipe of combining different types of things, taken from different locations within Akasha. Thus, semantic space is like the canisters we use to keep one type of thing, rice, pulses, vegetables, salt, sugar, water, and spices. But physical space is like the pot used to mix and combine them using a recipe. The same thing happens while writing a book. We take words that are on different pages of a dictionary and place them next to each other in a sentence. If the dictionary of a language was fixed, each word would have a fixed location in the dictionary space, and hence it could be likened to a semantic space. While the words in a book are not physical entities, the proximity of these words is created by picking up words from the dictionary to create sentences, just like the proximity of things in ordinary places. For someone to think that because the words in a book are proximate in one way, so the words in the dictionary could not be proximate in another way, is simply false. It arises out of the fact that we are so conditioned to physical thinking that we are unable to understand different kinds of proximities. Now the question arises, how is ordinary proximity created? The answer is consciousness and choice. Hypothetically, if I could see one thing with my left eye, another thing with my right eye, hear one thing with my left ear, another thing with right ear, smell one thing with my left nostril, another thing with my right nostril, then I could combine all these sensations on a private canvas that will be just like a room with table, chair, bed, wardrobe, shoes, clothes, and so on. If I could successively direct my eyes, nostrils, and ears to different things in the world, then I could successively capture and release those things onto and from my private canvas. So, an ordinary space can be created by consciousness and choice if it is able to capture and release different things from Akasha and assemble them into a canvas we incorrectly call physical space. The only trouble is that ordinary living entities like humans or animals, can't do such things. The role of divinity in science. So, if ordinary living entities do not create the ordinary perceived world, then could someone else do it? This is where Vedic texts offer insights into how the world is created. The Akasha is the consciousness of Shiva and equated to Brahman. The Vedanta Sutra equates Brahman to Akasha, which has been wrongly interpreted by some philosophers as an impersonal empty space, rather than the personal canvas of conscious experience within Shiva. Within Brahman, the creation, maintenance, and destruction of the perceived world happens under the control of deities called Brahma, Vishnu, and Rudra, respectively. Brahma assembles the perceived world by capturing select portions of Akasha, like a cook making a meal by combining ingredients from different vessels. Vishnu maintains this combination because someone has to maintain a world previously created by conscious capture, and allocates it to souls depending on their previous actions, like a server delivering a meal cooked earlier to deserving customers. Finally, Rudra destroys this combination by taking away the plate of meal and washing it clean. That destruction is the release of observable elements, sound, touch, sight, taste, and smell, into their respective vessels from which they had earlier been captured by Brahma. Thus, Akasha is never destroyed, which is why the material energy is described as eternal, although the material world is described as temporary. There is no conflict between an eternal Brahman, equated to Akasha, and a temporary world appearing within Akasha, because the temporary world is created by capture and release of portions of eternal Akasha. We do this capture and release every time we use the dictionary words immanent in our mind to produce sentences. Therefore, if the world is words, then it can also be created by the capture and release of words in a cosmic mind. Factually, we know that we are creating sentences by capture and release of words in our mind, but we also know that we are not doing so for the world we perceive. To interpret acts that we have not done as acts that nobody has done is simply a leap of blind faith. That leap involves saying that the world is moving physical objects within an empty physical space. But everyone doesn't think in the same way. Those who have introspected on how they create sentences from words in the mind can understand how the world is created as sentences by a cosmic mind. Now Akasha becomes an empty mind, which is not truly empty because it already holds an expansive dictionary of words. Even when the mind is not thinking any thought, the dictionary of words immanent in the mind is never destroyed. The physical and mathematical conception of the world is an after effect of Abrahamic religions, purging God's role in this world through the depersonalization of nature. While they called God omnipotent and omniscient, those were simply the remnants of pagan religions in which God was actively involved in governing nature. God's omnipotence and omniscience lost its meaning in Abrahamic religions after nature was said to be governed by mathematical equations rather than God's will. Factually, God became ignorant and powerless after the advent of science. His only role was forgiveness of people's sins, which religions called God's benevolence. Thus, we got an impersonal science and a benevolent God. Science says there is no sin or piety. And religion says that even if there is sin, God forgives it for believers. That depersonalization doesn't apply to the Vedic tradition, which never purged God's role in this world. That world is described as both eternal and temporary because ingredients from which the world is constructed through the process of capture and release are eternal, but that capture and release is temporary. The ingredients are simultaneously in their original containers and in the perceivable things, because those things are created by the capture and release of eternal ingredients by divinities. This capture and release is not a physical process. It occurs by the choice of consciousness, quite like I can capture and release sounds, touches, sights, tastes, and smell by changing my conscious focus. The Vedic term for creation is srishti, produced by gathering and combining. For maintenance is sthiti, staying or standing. And for destruction is nilaya, merging back. Srishti, sthiti, and nilaya occur due to Brahma, Vishnu, and Rudra, respectively, by their will and conscious intervention. The Akasha is Brahman, the semantic space comprising ingredients to produce conscious experience. Vedic cosmology describes how ingredients are used to create the universe comprising of graha, or houses, for living entities. They are just like houses comprising table, chair, bed, wardrobe, shoes, clothes, and yet they are different kinds of houses meant for different kinds of living entities. Thereby, even the creation within Akasha is not uniform. Rather, each planet and indeed each place within that planet is unique. This diversity is not an accident of nature, nor is it man-made. It is created, maintained, and destroyed by the divinities for different kinds of living entities, enabling them to live with their own kind. If someone's nature changes, the divinities move them through rebirth to a place meant for a different kind of living entity. Akasha depends on semantics. Thus, the understanding of Akasha can never lead to an atheistic science, or a science in which God is purged from the world. The understanding of Akasha can never create a world devoid of meaning and purpose, or mind-body separation. The theory of Akasha can never be equated to the idea of space and science created by Abrahamic religions after the depersonalization of nature. Simply by understanding one idea fully, that is, Akasha, we get a theistic science inclusive of meaning, purpose, and personalization, and free from the problems of incompleteness and inconsistency arising out of mathematics. Of course, this is quite novel and difficult, but it is far better than disparate theories, such as those that separate physics from psychology, or those that separate a theory of matter from that of space-time. When everything is encompassed within a single theory, the theory's complexity is far greater than that of theories which deal with different things separately. However, the combined complexity of dealing with everything is far lesser in an encompassing theory than in multiple disparate theories. To equate this complex reality to the ether or space of modern science is simply a misrepresentation, totally detached from the descriptions in the Vedic texts, such as Akasha having the property of Shabda, heard by the sense of hearing, or Akasha accommodating the internal and external existences of living entities, or that the five senses of hearing, touching, seeing, tasting, and smelling are organized in a hierarchy. It is also detached from the fact that the concept of ether was debunked when the theory of relativity was created, after which notions of objective truth were lost. It is further detached from the fact that mathematics is an inconsistent and incomplete language, so a mathematical description of space will also describe space incompletely. For instance, mathematical descriptions cannot be used for mental or sensual spaces. Finally, it is detached from the fact that physical concepts of space create the mind-body interaction problem, after which the mind is dumped into a corner to be studied only by the psychologists, whereas the concepts of space and time are physicalized and mathematized. If we want to get out of all these problems, we have to start rethinking reality in a completely different way. The physical models of science are dead. Those keeping them alive are spinning their wheels in wet mud, digging themselves deeper into a hole, which will make coming out of that hole even harder. The alternative to that hole is not private belief or faith. It is also science, just not the science that arises out of removing meaning from matter. As it integrates meaning and matter, it is a better science. Ashish Dalela, Why Akasha is Not Ether, in Shabda Journal, August 11th, 2025. https://journal.shabda, that's shabda.co/2025/08/11/y-akasha, that's AKASA, -is-not-ether //